Hi wonderfully created! I'm going to show you how to make a pattern piece for your upper body, your chest, your back and your arm. This tutorial is very detailed, so if you can watch all the way through, you're going to get a lot of tips and things you may not have considered. If you need to go to certain points though, there are timestamps in the description box to make it really easier because it is packed with detail. I made this tutorial based on bringing together different perspectives about how you can make a bodice piece. I made this brownish orange one and then tweaked it, putting my own spin on it. By doing that, I came up with this green piece which was snug and fit me perfectly. So hopefully you'll be able to follow along with this tutorial and make something tailored just for you. I'm going to show you how to take your measurements. I'm going to show you what tools you need to draft your pattern piece, how to draft the pattern piece, how to add seam allowance to then make a top with the pattern piece, and how to read your pattern piece to be able to add a zip. This video is not just for the bodice. The bodice is your front and your back, but it's also for the arm piece in case you want to add sleeves. Now, I was going to put everything into one video, but it's going to be too long. So subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you can see when the next part is uploaded. So let's start off with what you need. You'll need some paper. It could be any paper. You can take paper and glue it together if you really want to. You can use wrapping paper. Just any paper that's going to stand the strength of being written on. I have this roll of packing paper from years ago, so that's what I tend to use. You need paper to draw your measurements on. You need a straight ruler to draw with. You need a flexible ruler to measure with. You're going to need something to write with. Just having a pencil should be fine. I have a range of colors, pens and pencils, so it stands out in the video. You're also going to need paper scissors. I have two here, one small, one big. Having one is fine. Optionally, you can have this French curve ruler which helps you draw curves. You don't need it. And finally, I recommend you having a book where you can record your measurements, and if you want you can do a quick sketch of the measurements you actually took, just so in the future you remember what is what. The other preference is to simply list the names, waist, hip, etc., which I'm going to go through. So now let's look at the measurements. Now, something I want to put out there, if you've seen other tutorials, is there are standard measurements for certain parts of the body. For example, there's a standard measurement for the shoulder which is used universally no matter the pattern, but in this tutorial and from my research, I just thought if you're measuring yourself, why don't you just tailor it? So I'm going to tell you about the standard measurements, but I'm also going to tell you how to take the exact measurements so it fits you. If you want to convert between centimeters and inches, simply type into Google and it will tell you. You can decide what you measure in. 1 inch is roughly 2.54 centimeters. When you're measuring, you need to keep two things in mind. Do not over tighten. You want to take your actual measurements, and also make sure your tape is parallel to the floor. You don't want your tape to be tilted. Wrap it round evenly. Let's start off by measuring the hip, which is the widest part of your bum area. You're going to wrap the whole thing around and take your measurement. Then measure your waist. Your waist is the smallest part of your belly. Measure your bust, which is the widest part of your boob area all the way around. Then measure nipple to nipple, which is just the front part from one nipple to the other. Then measure the upper bust, which is where your bust starts. Make sure the tape is parallel to the floor. Then hold onto that upper bust and measure from that point to your shoulder. Other people don't really mention this, but I just thought, why not? It helps things be precise to your measurement. Then you want to measure from one point of your shoulder to the other point, which will represent your chest measurement. Then measure one of the shoulders, and that will be your shoulder width. If you want to make a pullover top, a top where you don't need a zip, you want to measure the whole circumference around the widest part of your head. Then you're going to measure the differences. You're going to measure from your shoulder to your bust, not your upper bust, your bust, the widest part, then your bust to your waist, and then your waist to your hip. These measurements do have standard measurements that people just apply. The standard measurement for your shoulder to your bust is 10 inches. Not your upper bust, your bust. If you want, you can check if this actually works for you, and if it makes it easier for you, you can just use 10 inches for shoulder to bust. For bust to waist, the standard measurement is 6 inches, and then for waist to hip, the standard measurement is 8 inches. But again, tailor it to you, why not? Let's look at the arm. For the arm, you want to measure the widest part of your hand. Then you want to measure your upper arm, and the additional measurement I have is to measure your upper arm to your shoulder joint. You also want to measure your arm's eye, which is this widest part perpendicular to the floor going straight up. Measure it like you've been measuring others. Take that measurement but also tighten it a bit. You don't want it uncomfortable, but do tighten it because that area is one of the most flexible measurements when it comes to the pattern piece, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later. Then you want to measure from your hand or your wrist all the way to your shoulder joint, and measure from your elbow to your shoulder joint as well. If you want to be specific, you can measure your elbow and your wrist circles, but you don't really need them, and I'm going to explain why later. But if you want, you can take them and record them. On the screen, I'm going to tell you all the measurements that you should have recorded, the ones you need to divide by 4, the ones you need to divide by 2, and the ones that are fine by themselves. The reason why you divide some of the measurements by 4 is because if you take your upper body, you have your front and your back. That's already divides your whole roundabout measurement into 2, front and back. Now for most clothing, your front is symmetrical. So if you take your front measurement and then fold that, you've halved a half. So in total, you only need to draft half of your front or half of your back. Now, if you only draft half of your front, that's a quarter of your whole roundabout measurement. That's why you find a lot of people will take a measurement like their waist and divide it by 4, and then add a bit of allowance for sewing later. But just in case you were wondering, then you might ask, well, why are some of the measurements divided by 2? The reason why some of them are divided by 2 is, for example, they only cover one part. If I then imagine drafting the front piece, I only need a half to get a quarter. I just thought I'd explain that because you may have heard these things done and not know why, and hopefully that's somewhat of an explanation. The pattern piece we're going to draft is a very basic exact piece, so that means we're not going to add any allowance, but it's actually very simple to add allowance. And when I show you how to use the pattern piece, I'm going to show you exactly how to add the allowance, but it's simply just adding an inch all the way around depending on whether or not you're folding your piece. Now, final tips, enjoy the journey. Grab a snack, have something to drink whilst you're drafting your pattern piece, because once you've done it, it's going to be really useful for making tailored pieces. Use a pencil, rub things out. Don't worry if you make a mistake, roll with it. When you're drafting this pattern piece, you need to make sure that the width of the paper is more than half your whole hip. You also need to make sure that it's a lot taller than your torso. So from your hip to your shoulder, you need to make sure it's a lot longer than that. The bigger the paper, the better. Take your paper and fold it in half. This is because we're going to use it to draft the front and the back template. Now we're going to start off by drafting the front. We're only going to draft half of your front because most clothing pieces are symmetrical. Now I'm going to give myself some room and I'm going to draw a line about an inch down from the top. Then I'm going to take my shoulder to bust measurement and mark it down from that first line, and then draw a line throughout my paper again. These are just guidelines. Then take the difference from your bust, not your upper bust, your bust to your waist, and then again use that to draw a line all the way through a guideline. And then finally take your measurement from your waist to your hip and mark that on. I like to put on 2 or 3 markings just to make sure that once I draw that black line, it's nice and straight and parallel to the other lines needed. And that will represent your hip. Draw a line all the way through, and then we're going to pop in our exact hip, waist and bust measurements for a quarter. Take your hip measurement, which you should have divided by 4. Let's say that once you divided it by 4, you got 9.5 inches. You're going to measure 9.5 inches from the fold on the bottom line and then mark it, and that will represent your hip. I like to add half an inch onto that measurement because I tend to find that in your hip you move around more. You're sitting, you're walking, you're running, so that room is preferable to me, and it makes it not uncomfortably tight depending on what you're sewing. Take your waist measurement. You should have divided this by 4. Put that measurement on the fold and then mark on where it ends on your black line. You're then going to add 1 inch to this measurement. This is because in a moment we're going to remove an inch in the middle for a dart. Why do we have darts? Darts help the material lie on your body more, and they remove weird creasing. Then take your bust measurement, the widest part of your bust area, divide it by 4 and mark it on. We're not going to add anything to this measurement. Next, let's make the dart. Take your nipple to nipple measurement. You should have divided this by 2 and mark it on from the fold on each of the 3 bottom lines, not your shoulder line, the bust, waist and hip. This will show us where the dart needs to go. Then you're going to draw a line connecting those 3 points you've just popped on. Now that guideline is drawn, we're going to actually measure the start and the end of the dart. Position your ruler so it starts at your bust. You're going to measure 1 inch down from your bust and mark it on the dart line you just drew. Then take your ruler and position it at the hip and you're going to measure up 2 inches. Those are the starts and the ends of your dart. We do this so that it doesn't take off too much from the widest points at your bust and your waist. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take off the inch we added onto the waist at the middle point of the dart. We're going to do this by taking an inch and making sure there's 0.5 on each side of the dart. Once you've measured those 4 points, all that's left to do is connect them so it kind of forms 2 triangles on top of each other. Make sure you're starting from the 2 inches up from your hip and then drawing from the 1 inch down from your bust. Now let's work on the shoulder. Go to that first line you marked on and measure an inch down. The reason is because we're going to slant the shoulder slightly because most of our shoulders are not exactly parallel to the floor. They have a slight gradient slant. Once you've done that, you're going to draw a line all the way down using that guide points, and that's going to help draw your slant. Then take the shoulder to shoulder measurements you took before, sometimes referred to as the chest measurement. That should have been half. Starting from the fold, mark on where that ends. Then take your shoulder measurement. Mine was about 10 centimeters. You don't need to half it or quarter it. Put the 10 on the marking you just made. I then like to swing around the ruler to show me where the shoulder measurement should end. Some people use mathematics and other measurements to show you how this should be done. I just like using the exact measurements. Why not? This first line was a guideline. The second line shows us where our shoulder ends once it's slanted. From this second line, you're going to mark on the measurement from your shoulder to your upper bust. This should be the exact measurement you took. You don't need to divide it by 2 or 4. It's the exact measurement. I'm marking it at 2 points and then using that to draw a guideline. Then go back and take your upper bust measurement, divide it by 4 and mark it from the fold to the point it ends on your guideline. I like to then add an inch. Later on when we draw the armhole, you're going to see that this inch is flexible. You could probably increase it to 1.5 inches additionally. It just helps the arm sit nicely. It accommodates for the fact that you need to move your arm up and down, and so additional material may be needed. Go back to where your shoulder ends and draw a guideline from that point to the upper bust line. Measure this line you just drawn and find the halfway point. Mine was about 7 inches, so the halfway point would be 3.5 inches. This is going to help you know where to curve your armhole. Classically, from this point, most people mark about ½ inch. If you want to, you can go up to an inch depending on how much room you need. What you're then going to do is draw a curve from the point your shoulder ends to your actual upper bust ending. You can use a French curve by manipulating it slightly, but if you don't have a French curve and you want to hand draw it, you can either just go for it, freestyle, enjoy yourself, caution to the wind, or you can put on these straight lines to help you. So I'm going to remove this French curve and show you how to actually draw this without one. Faintly draw a straight line from the top end of the shoulder to your indentation to the point your bust actually ends. Notice I'm not going all the way to the second dot where I added an inch. I'm stopping at that first dot. Then that can be your guideline for your curve, and then just go for it. You notice I mess up a bit. It's fine. It's just a pattern piece. Go back, knitting it up, and you're all good. Nobody has to know. This represents your front curve. That being said, we folded up this piece of paper so that we can use it to draw the front and the back pattern piece. We need to draw the curve for the back arm as well. The curves are different because of the way your arm works. The front of your arm needs to be indented a bit more so that it removes unnecessary creasing. So notice how when I'm drawing the back line, I'm going to the outermost point at the midpoint and at the end of the armhole. Now in a moment we're going to come back and adjust that a bit more, but first let's draw the neck. Measure from the midpoint to the start of the shoulder. Once you've got that measurement, mine was 3.5 inches, you want to measure that down. Now this neckline is flexible because this is just a bodice and you're going to adjust it to whatever you want to make it later. What I would advise though is that you measure an inch down to represent the front neck. Now, I make various adjustments to the neck, so it doesn't really matter. As long as you follow that roughly, it should be okay for a basic neck. I drafted various little points on my bodice and then used that to guide my curve. You don't have to do that, you can just freehand it. If you want to make a pullover top, a top where you don't need a zip, it goes straight over your head, I'd advise you to record down the circumference of your head somewhere near the neck. So back to the armhole, you want to measure your armhole from one point back to it. Take your flexible measuring tape and measure it to the top, then fold it, continuing measuring. We measured the arm's eye earlier. It was the one measurement that we tightened as well. You want this measurement here at this armhole to be between your normal measurement and your tightened arm's eye measurement. If it's not, you need to make adjustments. Classically, the issue is that it's too short. So there's two ways you can adjust it. The first way is to indent the middle point a bit more. When we took in the midpoint a bit earlier, we only took it in by ½ an inch, which is about 1 centimeter. You can go up to 1 inch. So I just indent it a bit at a time and then keep measuring it until it's okay. Mine looks a bit more messier because I went straight in with the black pen, but hopefully you're using a pencil and then you can go over that with your final line. The way to gauge this is to look at the difference between the neck and the armhole. You don't want it to be too different, wide on one part and really thin on the other. It should generally look quite equal going down. Now if that still doesn't work, you can go back to the end of the arm. Earlier, when we marked the upper bust, we added an inch for flexibility and movement. You can extend this and mark that as your end point if you need more room. My advice is to indent the midpoint first and then extend the end point if you really need it. Now, if this is still not working, what you probably want to do is go back to your measurements and make sure you've done that correctly. Now it's time to connect everything up. I'm going to connect my original endpoint because I don't need that additional part at the end of the arm's eye. I'm going to connect that to the bust and then that to the waist, and then I'm going to connect that line to the hip. What I like to do is at the hip, I like to make sure that that line is at a 90 degree. It just makes it slightly easier and lays better when you actually sew it. And then I curve that into the rest of the lines. I then advise you to actually write down the measurements you use. If you're making this for someone else or for yourself, the measurements are useful for later in case you either increase in size or decrease in size. You know the points that need to be adjusted without necessarily having to draft a whole other basic bodice. It's also helpful because when you're making adjustments and you're doing different styles in dresses or tops or whatever you're making, you can gauge which parts you need to draw your line to or adjust without having to measure your whole self again. For some reason, the clip where I actually cut out the piece is missing, but it's very basic. All you have to do is cut out the most outer lines. The only slight difference is the adjusted back armhole. We adjusted it from the outermost black to the outermost red. So instead of cutting the outermost black armhole, I'm going to cut the outermost red. Once you've done, you're going to open up your piece. You're now going to have two identical sides, but we don't want to keep it that way. As you can see, I've extended the waistline, the bust line and the upper bust line to my back, so I have those lines ready to go. The first thing I'm going to do is actually add on the darts for the back because your back also has a curve. Initially, we halved the nipple to make the dart for the front. I'd advise you to take that measurement and add an inch to it and then mark it. Once you've marked it on your hip, waist, bust and upper bust, you're going to draw a line all the way down. The slight difference here is that this line is going all the way to the upper bust. When we did the front piece, we only did it to the bust, but your back is slightly different. Once you've drawn this line, you're going to mark an inch down from the upper bust line, not the bust, the upper bust. Then you're going to go to your hip and you're going to mark 2 inches up. Once done, go to the waist and mark ½ an inch on either side of the waist, so you take off an inch for the dart and then connect the dart up. Go from the inch down from the upper bust to your waist to 2 inches up from your hip. This part is optional, but I do advise it. What you find sometimes when you're making a fitted piece is the back can crease when you add a zip. So what I like to do is draft the indentation into the back. So what you do is at the waist, you're going to bring it in 1/2 inch. You're then going to mark 4 inches up from the hip and 2 inches down from the bust. Connect those parts up and that will help you indent the fabric a bit so it doesn't create those ruffles. Transfer over your measurements and also make sure you mark on the neck and then cut it straight down the middle. Now let's adjust the front. Cut out the innermost indent for the armhole because that was a front indentation, and cut out the indentation for the neck. As I mentioned before, I kind of played around with this and decided just to leave mine a bit higher up. It doesn't matter too much. You can just follow the guidelines mentioned before. Mark on which piece is the back and which is the front. Also mark on where the fold should be or where any possible cut should be as well. I didn't draft on the seam allowance because I really wanted this to be a basic bodice which you can manipulate to create other things. So in the next video, I'm going to try and show you how to draft the arm piece, but also show you how to use the bodice with seam allowance to actually draft a basic top with a zip and how to read the measurements you've just created properly to make this. The reason why I wanted to do the bodice and the arm together is because I noticed some bodice pieces online don't accommodate for the fact that you need flexibility for the movement of the arm. So when I've drafted some armholes using online patterns, it's a bit tight or it's just awkwardly sat. I would have loved to put them all together in one video, but it was just getting way too long. So I'm going to try and get the arms one done as quickly as possible so that you can see it. I do normally like posting on Thursdays, but if I can get the arms one done any earlier, I will pop it up there. So any of you who are enthusiastic to get this all done, you have it available. The best way to keep updated is to turn on the notification bell after you subscribed. Hopefully when the video is about making basic pieces like a strap top, t-shirt or hoodie comes out, we can look at doing them with a basic t-shirt and with a pattern as well. If you want more information and a list of the details you need to make this, I hope to upload it on CreatedIAm.com in the coming days, so check it out, subscribe to the email list. But of course, more importantly, I hope you remember that you are wonderfully created.